This week we're going to look at the process of restoration. And as we've already discussed as through this introductory material this semester, we really want you to understand, and you should understand by now, that the process of restoration and the concept of ecological or ecosystem restoration is that it's really an applied science and it's an applied profession. In many ways similar to medicine or other conservation or management activities, where as a professional in these fields, you will generate both knowledge and then use that knowledge to help solve problems. In this case, how do we restore, how do we fix the structure and function of disturbed ecosystems? It's also important to point out that restoration is a design profession. So as a restoration professional, you have the ability to influence the three-dimensional form and function of a landscape by shaping the size and the shape and the structure and composition and ecosystem processes, the interactions between plants and animals on a specific site. So for in this example, trying to restore a riparian area, you have the ability to design and shape the future structure of this area, of this site, through your restoration process. In this case, planting lots of trees, and then working and finding ways by using these kinds of tubes to prevent herbivory by deer. So again, you have the ability to really influence and shape the site that you're working on. So the process of restoration really has a variety of different aspects to it. And regardless of whether you're going to work as an individual on a site, as a private consultant, or whether you're part of a larger firm that's working on a large collaborative restoration plan, all restoration projects are going to follow a plan, whether that's going to be written down for others to follow and learn from, or whether it's going to remain in your head as a memory or written down on a piece of paper. So this restoration plan is going to set a goal and recommend a set of strategies that will take a site from the condition it is in at the start to a condition that matches the goal or our reference condition. The plan also should include checks and balances, which are built-in series of opportunities to evaluate whether the chosen strategies are working or whether a mid-course correction needs to be made, following the adaptive management principles we talked about last week. And so having this explicit systematic process is particularly important for many restoration projects that are conducted in public settings. By using this process that we'll cover today, it will help you develop transparent decisions, justified with explanations and processes that allow for meaningful public involvement that go a long way in gaining support for your restoration project and resolving any conflicts and competing interests. Each restoration site, however, is unique and is going to require a similar unique process for restoration. However, any restoration process really can be simplified into several basic steps, and those are what we're going to discuss here today. So by following these steps, you'll produce a master plan, a site design plan, an implementation plan, a monitoring plan, and a management plan. Right? And so together, these sets of 5 plans that we'll be discussing really constitute the full project description and documentation. I think it's important to point out too, before we get started, that I'll be presenting these steps in a linear fashion. But it's important to know that the process is often more complex than how we'll outline here today. Usually you'll move back and forth among these steps as a project proceeds, generally with a different focus at each iteration. And as we go through, we'll find that there are different feedback loops and different stops and different areas where we will reevaluate and redefine and go back and think about how we can improve our project. The beauty of this process and the resulting plans is that it remains flexible and subject to revision as new information is developed or discovered, or that site conditions change. For example, if you may find that the goals of a restoration are set before the site conditions are known, right? So you propose these initial project goals, and then you may proceed to a site inventory and analysis. But in practice, when you work as a restoration professional, you will usually have some idea about the features of the site before or at the same time you are articulating a project purpose. And in fact, these preliminary goals really will help direct what you will be trying to inventory as part of that step of the restoration process. Then the results of the inventory will help you further refine the restoration plan and its goals. So let's look a little more in depth at the different steps of the restoration process. So the first two steps in the restoration process really have several purposes. They establish the general principles for guiding the project and articulate what you hope to accomplish. They help propose a use policy describing the ways that individuals and other people, both within your organization as well as outside, will be able to interact with the site. They also help you gather and synthesize as much existing information as possible about the past restoration efforts, as well as the current composition, structure, and function of these natural systems that you may believe are appropriate for the site. In other words, our reference conditions. And finally, they will help you determine the site's current natural and cultural conditions. So in many ways, what we looked at a few weeks ago, where we looked at state and transition models in our virtual field trip to Wyoming, a lot of what they were doing was a lot of these first steps, trying to understand what's there, doing that site inventory, and then developing a model through that state and transition model to help guide you and think about what specific practices might you use to actually improve the quality of that site and help restore the structure and function. Right? So the first step is to really define the project purpose. And here you're going to identify that purpose, what is our goal, and think about what is the reference conditions in terms of our primary objective. If we're working for the National Park Service, that may mean that our project purpose is to return that ecosystem to a pre-European condition. Okay, if we're working for the Nature Conservancy or some other nonprofit organization, there may be specific goals that are part of our mission statement as far as developing and restoring natural landscapes. Or if we're working for the Leopold Foundation, it may be thinking about how we might conserve and use these different ecosystems for a specific purpose. So the first step is to really understand that project purpose and define it. The second step then is to define our uses and policies. What are going to be the things, the policies that guide how we move forward? Are we dictated, in the example of the National Park Service, to really think about restoring back to pre-European conditions, which is actually in their management guidelines? Or are there cultural resources that are on a site that are important for us to keep and that we may want to think about certain policies and define the boundaries of how we move forward with our restoration plan? Once we've defined that purpose and then defined the uses and policy, we're really going to focus on three things. We're going to focus in on understanding the background. We're going to do an inventory and analysis, and then we're going to take that information and really develop more specific project goals. So in many ways, the background is going to be those state and transition models or other kinds of information, our understanding of natural successional processes of the specific ecosystem that we're working in, digging through the literature the scientific literature, or talking to individuals on the ground that know the site very well. And we're really going to think about documenting the history there. We're going to understand what's happened at the on these sites. We're going to try to understand what is the development and the natural processes that influence the development of an ecosystem, right? This, again, using that example from Wyoming in the rangelands, do we have a state and transition model that we can use that's going to really help us think about our reference condition and some of those practices when we get to the site plan that are really going to help us design the specific on-the-ground restoration practices that are going to help us restore the composition and structure and function of our disturbed ecosystem. We're also then going to do a site inventory and analysis. So we're going to inventory what's there, is there available already. So is there data on the plant communities, on the animal communities? What kind of GIS data layers do we have? What other maps do we have that we can use? And if we don't have those and they're not available, we're going to need to go out there and develop those on our own. So we want to develop a real good base map for the site. We want to map the cover types or whatever kind of units we want to segregate that site in our landscape we might be looking to restore, dividing them into some sort of unit. We want to describe those units and the cover types. And oftentimes, especially now in today's world, we want to probably set up some permanent photo sites where we can then go out, even if it's with with a cell phone, or whether you're using a camera on specific locations. But we want to document where those are, GPS those locations, so that we can have a visual inventory going forward. All right. Some of the other things that we can use to document the history are things like the historical aerial photos. We can obtain land survey information, identify areas that are in need of restoration just through a walkthrough. And then that will help us identify reference ecosystems. Oftentimes it's good to understand and have a reference ecosystem identified where we can go out and actually look at that site. Okay, and maybe do an inventory there, or look at other inventory and other information that maybe have been collected at a suite of sites that really represent that reference ecosystem that we really want to look for. Right? So in the end, we're really evaluating the suitability of a site and its physical, biological, and cultural resources with the respect to the project goals. Okay, and those project goals are going to then be refined based on kind of the overall project purpose, based on what we see there through our background information and our inventory analysis. So we're defining and we're improving and we're narrowing the focus of our specific project goals that we hope and will be working towards as part of this restoration process. So once we've done all that, we really want to then develop these realistic goals and objectives, base these on the time that we have, the financial resources that we have, constrained by the inventory and analysis information that we already have, and really combine all that information and develop a master restoration plan. This really encompasses the project vision and the solutions and the conceptual ideas that we have to actually reach those goals, right? And we may find that as we go through that process, that some of these goals and objectives as part of our master restoration plan are incompatible. And at that point in time, we'll want to then go back through this feedback look, and this is one of those steps where we will take time and think and adapt and go back and revise maybe our project goals so that they're more in line with what we think we accomplish. So in this step, as we develop the master restoration plan, we're going to develop the initial vision for what the restoration is hoping to achieve, translate that into a set of goals that describe the site as it will be after the completion of the restoration. Okay, and so we'll often also think about how people will be able to interact with this in a site use policy. Okay, so at this point in time, we may be thinking about, there may be some aspect to this plan where, you know, we may have issues with trails that we might need to close in the area until certain species become established, right? So we'd want to define how we're going to use and what kind of policies um, based on what we've found through our inventory analysis, where maybe we have a lot of areas that have compacted soils and invasive species, and we're going to do some sort of treatment that's going to require humans being excluded from this site while certain processes take hold, right? And we'd want to then define that in our project goals and include that into our master restoration plan. Okay, so depending on the size of the project, you might be working on this together with neighbors and other interested parties. And often, as a general rule of thumb, it's often best to think about 3 different visions or options. Okay, so if you're working on a large collaborative project, you'll want to think about 3 different versions or visions as part of this master restoration plan. And you'll want to work with your collaborative groups, your stakeholders, or those neighbors that have an interest or other constituents, and weigh the opportunities and constraints of each one before settling on one. Right? And so having to think of alternatives really helps ensure that you consider a variety of things about the particular site and not just apply this standard cookbook solution that as this semester has gone forward, I've tried to relay to you that that's really not a great way to address ecosystem restoration. And so once you decide on one of those 3 visions as part of that master plan, that is really what's going to then guide the next step, which is the restoration site plan. Okay, and so at this step, this is kind of gives you the actual 3-dimensional form of how you're going to take that master restoration plan that has these goals and objectives, that's based on this basic inventory and understanding of the site and area you want to restore, and really then drills down to try to, what is it about that we need to develop and how are we going to implement it? You know, if budget's going to be constrained, and often it is in many restoration projects, we might need to prioritize our efforts. Okay, and here you may need to think about what's going to come first. What are we going to do? And if money is and resources are going to be limited, which one is most important for us to achieve that restoration, that primary master restoration plan? So in this step, you're really going to refine the restoration goals by creating measurable objectives that you can use to assess the project of your restoration over time. Okay, so this plan is going to explain exactly which species should be present, where they should be located, and in what abundance, and in what arrangement. All right, so we're really going to focus on what species composition should be there, how they should be arranged in space, which is, if you recall, is a way that we would describe structure, and then what kind of function is that providing. All right, so it should also describe those functions or important ecosystem services and the nature of any disturbance cycles, such as what's the reoccurrence or what's the occurrence of fire. Are we going to allow fires to burn, or are we going to use prescribed fire on a frequent basis to try to emulate the natural disturbance regime and that natural fire regime? Okay, so here we're getting even more specific, and we're going to lay out specific measurable goals and objectives that we can then turn around and evaluate later in this plan. You'll also see here that there's another opportunity and another feedback loop during this site plan, where we may decide that once we get out there and we really start to piece together how we want the site and the plan, the restoration plan, to take shape, that we need more information. So you can see there's another stop here where we can go back into this previous step and we can collect and analyze additional information on the site if it's needed, and then revise and refine the layout of of the species and the communities and the ecosystems on our sites. All right. And it also is a place where we may want to really focus on locating any infrastructure needed to achieve our restoration plan, right? Are there areas where we can really hit and focus in on how do we go about putting seedlings out into a site? And in the third lecture video here this week from the Mount Rainier National Park, that really describes kind of a seasonal process that they have going through getting parts of their restoration activities established. You'll see that they have specific areas that they may want to restore, and they have to think about the logistics of getting that in and getting seedlings into these sites. So you have an area where you may need to think about, all right, well, I've got this idea, I need to plant this many species. Oh, how am I going to actually get those seedlings into the site if I need to plant 60,000 trees as part of this restoration plan? At that point in time, I may, if I haven't thought about that yet, I may need to think and go back to this background aspect and understand really where are my loading zones, unloading zones, where can I bring people together to meet, then to disperse across the site. So all of these are kinds of information that's really going to be critical for you to think about when you're developing this site plan. Once that site plan's developed, you really want to focus in on an implementation plan, right? And here, this is going to provide detailed instructions for achieving the objectives of the site plan, all right? And it's going to be based on the conditions that you have on the site, all right? So if you need to add species, this implementation plan, this next step that goes side by side with the site plan is going to describe how you should do it. Are we going to hand plant? Are you going to use a mechanical planter? Are you going to use seeds? Are you going to use transplants? What kind of transplants? So the how you're going to do the restoration, but also when it should be done. Is this going to be in the dry season, or is it going to be done in the winter? And then where on the site the species should be added. Okay, and so all of the aspects of the implementation part of this restoration plan really are going to be developed kind of in this sequential step. And you'll see that there's a lot of this that may go back and forth. You might find that you think about the specific objectives and how you plan to deal with that and the vision that you have is for the site plan. But then when it comes to the implementation, it may be impractical. So then you need to go back to the site plan to think about how you might modify that. So there's a lot of a dynamic nature and give and take between these two plans. And it's not as linear as I'm representing here, but it's something you need to think about as you move forward, right? So this plan is going to describe alternative strategies and reasons for choosing some over the others. And in many cases, before settling on any strategy, this implementation plan may suggest establishing experiments or demonstration field trials to test several techniques on a portion of the site and evaluating those results before applying the one that best fits the situation. So here we have adaptive management ideas and concepts really being integrated into our restoration plan and our restoration process. So after we've developed this master plan, we developed a site plan, and then developed a corresponding implementation plan, and we feel comfortable with that, then it's time to actually go out there and actually do it on the ground. And at this point, we actually act on our implementation plan. And then once that's done, we really focus on 3 final steps as part of our restoration process. And the first of that is going to be, we're really going to focus on monitoring, all right? And so monitoring is absolutely 100% critical to any restoration plan, and it's often one that's most often overlooked. And so really this monitoring plan is going to be how you're going to go about determining the progress of a restoration. Okay, your monitoring plan is for evaluating the extent to which the goals and objectives are being met as implementation proceeds. Right? It describes how you're going to measure and analyze procedures and rationales behind using them. And it really addresses two restoration stages. Right? The first is the time period from the implementation to the achievement of the restoration goals and objectives. Right? And then the time period after restoration is ended and management begins. Right? So it's absolutely critical in terms of moving forward and understanding how best to do this. Now, as part of that monitoring, there's always, as part of any kind of adaptive management process, you have this idea of research, right? Where you're going to document and see, was this successful? Was it not successful? Do we need to really think more about how we've laid this out? And if it hasn't been successful, then we really need to find ways and maybe do some sort of experimentation to see what is successful or why it wasn't successful. And then we're going to then turn that back and integrate that back into the site plan, which then will feed back into this implementation plan, which then will continue to monitor. And now we're back into that adaptive management loop that we talked about last week. And then finally, at some point in time, after we've gone through this process over time, we will have a point in time where our restoration goals and objectives that have been outlined as part of our master restoration plan have been met, and we've achieved those. And at that point in time, that's the management plan, and this final step really begins, right? And so ideally, you'll outline this management plan at the same time you're creating the site plan, implementation plan, and monitoring plan, with the anticipation that what you're going to do and what you're going to implement on the ground is actually going to work. Okay? Now, in the instances that there are unforeseen things that present themselves, which is almost going to be the case, that's where we use this adaptive management approach to revise and to continually think about how we're going to go out there and we're going to revise our site plan and revise our implementation plan. Okay? But at some point in time, we should get to a point where we feel like we've restored the site, we've achieved those goals, and now we using this model that we have, and in the case of the rangelands, kind of these state and transition models, we now have it into that undisturbed condition, or we have it on a trajectory where just continual management, or that we've restored some ecosystem process, whether it's fire, whether it's flooding if we're in a riparian zone, or whether it's some schedule of harvesting activities that emulate some natural disturbance process, such as a thinning from below that may emulate a low severity surface fire that's going to kill smaller trees, underneath a canopy that's going to help create a new type of structure in a stand, then that's going to help maintain it, and then we're just in a management mode. Okay, and so at that point in time, we're really just moving forward. So at this point, you have now an idea of the restoration process, how we move from the very beginning, defining kind of this project purpose, and through these various plans that you will develop in various stages that will help lead us into this final restoration plan. Now, there are some assumptions about this that we need to keep in mind, and if you look through the reading material for this week, you can spend a little bit of time in section 1.6 looking at this. But there are some things that you really need to think of, right? And so one assumption really is that there is some ecosystem process that's missing in this disturbed site, and you need to identify what that is. And then once you identify that process that may be missing from a site, then it's restoring that process will help restore the structure and function, which then will help that move that disturbed site into a restored site that's going to reflect that natural range of variation that characterizes our reference ecosystem. Okay, you'll also find that there are going to be many challenges, and we've already hit on some of these here this semester, from the fact that natural systems are going to be variable both in space and in time, and you need to somehow think about that as you develop this restoration plan. And then I think, as we talked about with Bradshaw, there's always this idea and this fact that we never really exactly understand everything there is about it, the ecosystem that we're trying to restore. And at this stage, we really want to continue to find as much information and use this adaptive management approach to really move restoration forward. And then finally, inevitably, unless you're restoring your own land and you have no other partners, which is usually not going to be the case, especially if you're working in many collaborative types of projects or collaborative organizations, or it's a multi-organization restoration plan. Say you're working with a national forest or a specific region, you're going to be working with a lot of different partners. And there's going to be a lot of conflicts often around what you identify as part of your goals, how you develop that plan, how you implement that plan, and then how you go about adjusting that plan and then continue managing those sites once you've achieved these restoration goals. And at that point in time, it's really focused on conflicts among users, right? And that's what we'll address next week, is how do you deal with that? How do you deal with people? How do you deal with this aspect of conflicts? And what are some best practices that you can use to avoid these kinds of conflicts that may arise as you move through this process that we've outlined here this week? Once we do that, then we'll really drill down and spend the rest of the semester really looking at some specific site plan techniques and implementation techniques for restoring different types of ecosystems that you may encounter over your career.